I'm Allison Louthan. Thanks so much for the invitation, and I'm excited to chat with you guys about work that I've been doing on the Venus flytrap. So I'm going to talk about fire effects on the Venus flytrap. But first, before I start, I want to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. So I'll be talking about actual data, and my collaborators, they're listed on the bottom. I also want to give a warning that I'll be mostly talking about fire effects, so this kind of stuff. I will be talking much less about what I suspect that many of you are interested in, which is the carnivorous aspect, but I'll come to that at the end, so don't fear. Okay, oh, there we go. Okay, so you all probably know this or sort of think about this all the time, but most people don't seem to know that Venus flytraps have a very small native range. So this is a picture of the United States, and then there's this inset of North and South Carolina. So these colors here indicate counties in which the Venus flytrap was extant, so present in those counties, or is currently present, excuse me. And then these red counties indicate places where the Venus flytrap has been thought to be extirpated. And so you can see, right, that the Venus flytrap has this really small range. And most actually North Carolinians that I talk to don't even know this. So spread the word, I guess. And within this small range, they occur in these longleaf pine savannas. So this is a picture of what those look like. So a savanna is defined as mostly grass, so you can, and other herbaceous organisms. You can see those down here, and then some trees kind of interspersed. So the thing that maintains the lack of trees in these savannas is thought to be fires. So essentially a fire will sweep through here, like shown in this picture, and it will burn up the small trees, right, that are in between the sort of larger trees, and thus maintaining these open stands. So, for example, you can see here, these trees are likely to be burned in the next fire, and that will sort of maintain this open savanna. In most of Venus flytrap's range, they live in these longleaf pine savannas. So these large trees are longleaf pine, and then much of this below ground vegetation is wiregrass. So a particular species that lives in North Carolina. And then anyone who's kind of grown Venus flytrap on their windowsill or wherever knows that it tends to like pretty wet habitat. So it occurs in kind of these wet microsites within this kind of larger kind of area. So I'll just sort of reiterate that healthy savannas in this region kind of look, where did my cursor go? It's gone. Okay. They look like, where the hell's my cursor? They look like this left-handed picture. So the one with the small trees in them. Sorry, I've lost my cursor for some reason. What the heck? There we go. Okay. And I and my collaborators have done work thinking about how Venus flytrap habitats, these longleaf pine savannas, have been affected by fire suppression. So these longleaf pine savannas, right, the ones I showed you in the previous slide, or these, this particular picture, are areas that have been recently burned. So these are nice, healthy savannas that have kind of experienced relatively frequent fire. But when you haven't burned for a very long time, there's really quite a lot of woody overgrowth. So you can see in that picture on the right, there's quite a bit of kind of woody vegetation here in the understory. And because, you know, fire hasn't burned in there for a long time. There's also, you can see in these pictures, this blue flagging that I and my collaborators have put out, and that orange flag. That's not a part of like normal pine savannas, but those are flagging like that we've been using to mark plots. So these longleaf pine savannas have the sort of fire target in these longleaf pine savannas has been dictated by other species of concern. So in particular, red cockaded woodpeckers, which I believe were just delisted off the Endangered Species Act, or off the Endangered Species list, but they really dictate a lot of kind of conservation policy in this region. And the target fire in return interval, or sort of how often you burn, has been every 3 years, which also matches historical records and helps, right, the red cockaded woodpecker. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. So what I'm going to talk about within the system today is understanding what are the effects of those target fire regimes, so that 3-year burn interval, on Venus flytraps, right? So Venus, we don't know much about, at least in a quantitative way, how Venus flytraps are affected by those fire targets. And another thing that two other things that we don't know much about is how widespread fire suppression in this region, so essentially conversion from this kind of environment to this kind of environment, might affect Venus flytraps as well, right? So a lot of these areas have been fire suppressed, suffered from fire suppression because they, it's expensive and challenging to burn some of these areas. And we also are interested in understanding how the effects of fire might play out kind of in the future. So under future climate conditions, when things are projected to be a little bit different than they are now, what should we do to manage fire for Venus flytraps in both fire suppressed areas such as this, and then relatively healthy longleaf pine savannas like that. Okay, and then, oops. There we go. And I will come back to this slide. So this is kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about, just as a reference point. So I'll talk first about effects of fire on Venus flytraps. I'll talk about future climate first, and then I'll talk about fire suppression. Then I'll talk about kind of what we're doing in the future and the importance of this work. Okay. Come on. Okay, so I and my collaborators have initiated in 2015 this really large scale monitoring study or monitoring survey. So this figure that I'm showing you here is a map, the same map that I showed you in the previous slides with extant and extirpated or counties in which Venus flytrap is extant or extirpated. And then sort of across the species range, or at least the east-west extent of it, we have monitored plants at 6 populations in each of 3 regions. So we have 2 populations at Fort Liberty, which is kind of obviously on the western part of the species range. And then we have 4 additional populations here at the eastern part of the species range. So we're monitoring these populations across much of the species range. And these populations all differ in kind of their burn regime. So some of these, right, have been burned quite recently, or were burned during the course of our study, and others haven't been burned for a very long time. And so we compared the performance of Venus flytraps in those 2 sets of conditions, long unburned and recently burned, to estimate fire effects. And then we also compared performance in kind of hot and cool conditions to infer climate effects as well. So, for example, Camp Lejeune is much more mild than Fort Liberty because it's closer to the ocean. And so we asked kind of what are the effects of climate, of ambient variation in climate on Venus flytrap performance. And this monitoring is quite detailed. So I'm showing you here a picture, like a really close-up picture of this adorable Venus flytrap. You can see its traps here, obviously. And these colored things, you can see a little green one down there, if you've looked for thousands of them like I have. These are painted nails, so they mark individual plants that we return to again and again every year. And the colors kind of help us locate, help us differentiate sort of among different plants. So it's quite detailed monitoring that's been going on for a very long time and will continue into the future. So this is just showing you a picture of our cute little plants again. So you remember kind of what we're doing in the field. So what we do in the field is we assess or we calculate how population dynamics are responding to various conditions. And the way that we do that is we follow plants throughout their life cycle. So Venus flytrap plants start as a little teeny tiny plant, right? So as a seedling. And those seedlings grow, right, to become a relatively large adult plant. Adult plants can survive from year to year. They actually live quite a long time. Adults can also reproduce, right, to make beautiful flowers, which can then, if they're pollinated, set seed, which can then recruit, result in recruits and sort of start the cycle again. So when we go out into the field, we keep track of a bunch of individuals, right? And we say, did they survive? Did they reproduce? How many new recruitment events did we see? How many new babies do we see? Okay, and we take those data from the field, and what we do is we combine them into a population model. And I won't talk at all about how this works. I wasn't sure kind of what the range of understanding of kind of statistics and modeling would be in this group. But I'll just say that we combine estimates of survival, reproduction, and recruitment. So all the rates that I just talked about in the last slide. And use both statistics and then a modeling approach to synthesize those rates into estimates of population growth. So here I'm showing you population growth on the y-axis. So essentially, right, we're saying if populations are getting bigger, right, or they're getting smaller, or they're staying the same size, which of course, right, if we're assessing performance is something we really care about. So you don't need to know anything about what this number is besides something very important, which is this critical value of 1. So if population growth is 1, what that means is that populations are stable, they're not changing over time. If population growth is greater than 1, that means that populations are growing, so they're doing well, right? If population growth is less than 1, that means populations are predicted to decline. So what we did was we tested for the effects of fire on survival, reproduction, and recruitment, and combined them to get an estimate of how population growth on the y-axis is affected by years between fires. So how frequently in this system fires occur. So a short fire return interval means that fires occur relatively frequently. And a long fire return interval means that fires occur very infrequently in that system. And this picture that I'm showing you, perhaps obviously, is just an example of how a pattern might look. So commonly species who have evolved in fire-dependent ecosystems like longleaf pine savannas show some optimal fire return interval that's intermediate, though other patterns are definitely possible, where population growth is highest, right, at moderate fire return intervals. Population growth is lower, and in fact, populations are predicted to decline if fires are super frequent or if fires are super rare. So that's kind of all I'm going to talk about the modeling methods, but I'm very happy, enthusiastic about answering questions about that. So we combine all the data that I showed over the previous slide, survival, reproduction, and recruitment, and the climate effects on those rates, as well as the fire effects on those rates, into estimates of Venus flytrap population growth. So I'm showing you here results from our model. I'm going to outline 3 aspects of this graph because there's kind of a lot going on here. So if you see something weird, just be patient. So here on the x-axis, right, we have fire return interval, frequent fires over here, infrequent fires over here. And then on the y-axis, we have Venus flytrap population growth. So this gray line indicates this value of 1, right, above which populations grow and below which populations decline. And then these two colors indicate kind of the climate conditions. So we had a series of hot and dry climate conditions shown in red, and then a series of cool and wet climate conditions shown in black. So I think the first thing that immediately sticks out, at least to me, is the contrast between the red and black lines. So, right, you can see that Venus flytrap appear to do better under hot and dry conditions, right? So their population growth is higher, as indicated by this red line, when conditions are hot and dry relative to when they're cool and wet, as indicated by this black line. And this is not what we expected, right? So I mentioned earlier that Venus flytrap, they really like these kind of wet microsites. So this was quite surprising, right? Hot and dry, you think you'll probably have fewer wet microsites. Seems like they shouldn't like that habitat. So one thing to know about this climate effect is that, as I alluded to when I was introducing these populations, we're really assessing the effect of kind of ambient or sort of normal climate conditions on Venus flytrap. So we do not have any data to ask sort of what are the effects of extreme temperatures, like very, very hot or very, very dry. So there's the possibility, right, that performance could decrease dramatically under very hot and dry conditions, such as those that we might expect in the future. So one of the things that we're doing in this system that we're excited about is this field season. So in June, when we go out to measure Venus flytraps, we're going to set up a warming experiment that's actually crossed with rainfall manipulation to quantify kind of if we really push temperatures to be very hot and very dry, what will happen? And we suspect that we'll sort of see a crash in population growth, suggesting that hot and dry conditions maybe are not the best for Venus flytrap, but we don't know what will happen, obviously. Okay, so that's the first thing sort of that I notice about this graph. The second thing that I notice about this graph, right, is that in both hot and dry conditions and cool and wet conditions, Venus flytrap population growth is really affected by fire return interval. So they do the best at this relatively long fire return interval of 10 to 12, or really 8 to 12 here. They do poorly, right, at relatively frequent fires, right? And they do poorly at very infrequent fires. And so this fire return interval, so how often you burn, right, seems to be important for Venus flytrap population growth. So it does matter, right, how often you burn this particular species. And okay, that's perhaps not surprising because this graph that I'm showing you here kind of outlines the expectation of what we thought might happen based on other species responses, some intermediate optimal fire return interval. What was very surprising is that in this ecosystem, the historical fire return interval is indicated by this little asterisk, is somewhere around 2 or 3. So these savannas burn very, very frequently. And what this what our results would predict is that Venus flytraps should be doing terribly in that system. That if you burn relatively frequently, that Venus flytrap would go extinct, right? So populations will decline, right, to extirpation. And that's true under both hot and dry conditions and cool and wet conditions. So that was really surprising and very concerning, very concerning. And so we thought about why this might occur, right? Like we would expect that optimal fire return interval or the best conditions for Venus flytrap would reflect kind of how they evolved historically. And we came up with kind of an explanation, which I'll talk about testing in the next few slides, that we think might describe what's going on. So those 6 populations that I mentioned when I was sort of setting up this when I showed you that map, are all quite fire suppressed. So this is showing you, or sorry, they haven't been burned for a very long time. And so what we think might be happening is that the effect of a fire return interval and this optimal FRI, and the reason that it doesn't match sort of what we would predict is that these areas have been fire suppressed. And so we think this response to fire return interval might vary in suppressed places where there's been historically no fire, and areas where fire is relatively frequent. And so we think, right, that a fire in fire suppressed areas, like the ones we studied, should be really hot and kind of damaging, should be hot and damaging. And a fire in historically burned areas should be sort of cool, relatively cool. So that if we measured what's happening with Venus flytrap in areas that are that are frequently burned, we would see this sort of optimal fire return interval that's much shorter, essentially, that it's best to burn frequently. Okay, so just to summarize what I've told you, so that in terms of fire, or in terms of future climate, at least when populations are infrequently burned, a relatively short FRI, fire return interval, will reduce population size. And I'll talk now about kind of our tests of this hypothesis. Are there less intense fires in these kind of frequently burned areas that lead to positive impacts of frequent fires, and more intense fires in these kind of habitats that lead to this long optimal fire return interval? Okay, so in 2018, after we initiated this large experiment, we started monitoring populations in the Green Swamp, which is this other site that's in southern North Carolina. The Green Swamp is frequently burned, so it's managed by the Nature Conservancy, and they do an amazing job burning every 3 years or so. So we began to collect data on what might be happening to Venus flytrap populations in areas that are actually frequently burned. And so we combined all those data in sort of a similar modeling approach to what I talked about a few slides ago to estimate how historical fire history modifies the response to current fires. So I'm just going to sort of go ahead and show you those results. So I'm just showing you here an example of one of the response variables that we measured. So here we have time since fire on the x-axis, and then the number of fruits on the y-axis. Blue, well, teal, whatever color this is, indicates areas that were sort of historically burned frequently, so not fire suppressed, and areas that are red indicate sort of historically unburned, areas that were quite fire suppressed. And so what we think might be driving some of our results that I showed about optimal fire return interval is that in areas that were historically burned, right, those fires cut down on woody vegetation, right? So they effectively suppress woody vegetation and lead to kind of minimal competitive effects, right? No matter the time since fire. So that in this case, number of fruits stays quite high, even after many years since fire, because there's essentially few woody plants. In areas that were historically unburned, right, there's a lot of woody vegetation that's present, not only above ground, but also below ground, that allows for rapid regrowth following a fire. So a fire will kill some of those woody plants, but not kill them fully, and they'll rapidly regrow. And that kind of competition drives declines in performance as time since fire increases. And so what that leads to in historically unburned areas is that fires essentially cannot suppress woody plants, and so you should burn infrequently to minimize the damage to fly traps. So essentially there are positives and negatives to burning. One of the positives, right, we think is reducing competition. One of the negatives is like you get burned. And so for historically unburned areas, essentially the negatives outweigh the positives. And so you should really try to burn infrequently. I'm going to skip this next one. Okay, so what we found is that this historical burn regime, right, so whether or not fires are burned, or whether or not historical fires were frequent seems to change the response to current fires. And we think this is because of this pattern where we have less intense fires in these open savannas that maintain woody biomass at low levels. And then we have more intense fires that maintain or that keep woody biomass at relatively high levels in these kind of environments. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to sort of talk about the implications of what I'm talking about and what we're doing next. So just to remind you that I told you earlier that about climate effects, higher temperatures seem to improve Venus flytrap performance, but we haven't actually measured extreme temperature effects. So don't get too excited thinking about that climate change is really going to be great for Venus flytrap because we don't know yet. I've also shown you that both current fires, right, and historical fire regimes seem to affect Venus flytrap. And I think our results suggest that management actions, like how frequently you burn, if you're worried about Venus flytrap, might differ based on history. So our results suggest that you should burn relatively infrequently for historically unburned areas and relatively frequently for historically burned areas. And I'll just say like, that is very tentative. I would like, don't anyone go doing this. But that's what our results suggest so far. We don't have the full story yet. One sort of caveat to this is that if you were to remove woody plants with herbicides, say in historically unburned areas, that could sort of reset the cycle to make these kind of frequent burns kind of the best for Venus flytrap. One of the things that we hypothesize for a mechanism driving this is these woody plants. So we think that they're really what's driving kind of declines in population growth. And so we're currently collecting data to test that hypothesis directly. Okay. So I've already mentioned kind of the future work that we've been doing, thinking about extreme climate events by warming Venus flytrap. And drying it out. And we're going to continue this monitoring of fire suppressed and frequently burned areas. And one of the things that I'm really hoping to start doing relatively soon is thinking about something that would probably be interesting to this group is prey populations, right? So fire will almost certainly affect which insects are present, irrespective of Venus flytrap. And obviously that could have kind of knockdown effects on Venus flytrap, right? How much prey they have available, and thus how well their populations are doing, and what kinds of prey they have available. So big or small plants, or delicious or not, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I'm realizing I didn't acknowledge my funders on this slide, so I'll just verbally do that, which are the SERDEP, Department of Defense Fund, strategic, well, whatever, SERDEP, I can't remember what it stands for, and then NSF has also funded this work. Thanks.
The ICPS, which is the International Carnivorous Plant Society, is an organization of horticulturists, conservationists, scientists, and educators, all interested in sharing the knowledge and news of carnivorous plants. We have been around since 1972. We started a newsletter back then, and now we have a full-color quarterly newsletter. The society is also a registered 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Right now, we have about 1,400 paid members, and this includes libraries, scientists, researchers, growers from all over the world. And we would love for you to become a paid member. We host at least one webinar a month. And just this morning, I added another scientist who's not on this slide, but they will be presenting in early March. And what I'm excited about, what I spend a lot of my year about, is World Carnivorous Plant Day. May 7th, 2025 is going to be the 5th annual World Carnivorous Plant Day. And we're going to be talking about that in just a little bit. This year, if you are interested in doing a video for us, which could be 30 seconds or it could be 2 minutes to 10 minutes, the theme is the number 5 because it's our 5th anniversary. So we're looking things like 5 easy ways to grow plants, or 5 reasons why fire ecology is important, or 5 fertilizers to use on carnivorous plants, or 5 pet store foods you can use on carnivorous plants. If you have experience in the field through conservation, cultivation, we are interested in you sharing your knowledge, because the more people are sharing their knowledge, the stronger our society can get. So if you're interested in presenting a webinar like Allison did, you can send me an email, or if you're interested in presenting for World's Carnivorous Plant Day, you can also send me an email. You do not have to have a PhD in botany. You could be a grower. You could be somebody who just likes to take field trips and see wild carnivorous plants. But we do need you and your support. All right. Thank you, Allison, for that brief commercial. Okay, I'm going to read you the questions, Allison,
Okay.
so people on YouTube know what we're talking about. Will asks, a burgeoning aspect of research grant writing is an education aspect. How can we better inform the public on the necessity of controlled burns for many species of carnivorous plants and other pyrophytes? May be connected with an increase to uncontrolled wildfires. And of course, this webinar is in February of 2025, and California once again just experienced horrible, uncontrolled wildfires.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I didn't catch who asked it, but thanks. So I didn't mention this at all, but we have a partnership with the North Carolina Botanical Gardens, where we are, as part of this funded work, are planning to give more information on like the effects of prescribed fires for landowners who might want to manage Venus flytrap on their property, and for the effects on other species. So I didn't mention this either, but we're also starting a monitoring program to ask how Venus flytrap responses mirror those in the general community, so other pyrophytes. We haven't quite fleshed out what that outreach activity will look like, but we're hoping that it can include things like example fires that we can show to landowners to sort of show them what it might look like, resources about where to hire a burn, a burn crew, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, yeah, uncontrolled wildfires are a big deal. With hotter and drier conditions, they're getting more and more intense and more frequent. And I guess I'm not sure if your question is like, you should tell people how to prevent wildfires. I'm not sure.
Maybe say, if you don't do this, you will have an uncontrolled wildfire in your backyard.
Yeah, totally. Yes, exactly. That could burn your house down. Yeah. And we're not trying to like tell people how to manage their land, but we're hoping that with some of this outreach activity that will reach a bunch of people, you know, who have longleaf pine savanna or forests really in their backyard, and hopefully give them some resources that they need to try to burn those areas.
Think about 2 years ago, we had a master student do a presentation for us on Sarracenia alata in Texas. And they said that they had to get permission from like all the landowners that they visited in Texas, because like more than 90% of wild Sarracenia are grown on private property. And that was like a big aspect of the ecology, was informing the landowners like, this county should be having a fire this year. This county should be having it this year.
Yeah. And I'm not sure how it is in Texas, but in North Carolina, there's a lot of totally reasonable restrictions on when you can burn. Like you can't burn when it's really windy, so you don't burn any houses down. And so it just becomes a really challenging logistical problem.
Yeah, I was also talking to some forest ecology people in California who own 900 acres, and they were saying that they have like master's degrees from like Harvard in fire ecology, but because they're next to a vineyard, they want to be friends with the vineyard people, and they don't want to ruin their income, but they also need to protect the vineyard from an uncontrolled wildfire.
Yeah, it's a bummer.
All right, the next question is from Josh. How will rare plant and animals respond to climate change? other than invasive species, do any groups of species have a good outlook?
That's kind of a big question. I
Do you
don't
know?
know if I'm qualified to answer this one, but there's not a lot of evidence that rare plants will respond super differently to common plants. So I think your question is more like how will plants and animals respond to climate change? Because we don't have the data to say how rare versus common plants will, or plants or animals. The data so far suggests,
I think people assume that everything is going to do worse
right,
except for the invasive species.
which is not true. So some species will respond positively, some species will respond negatively, irrespective of whether they're invasive or not. And the results are sort of idiosyncratic, right? It varies dramatically across species, and so far people haven't really been able to figure out why particular guilds are more sensitive or are affected positively or affected negatively. So it kind of is all over the map. I don't know if any groups of species have a good outlook. I think for most species, we're concerned about the possibility of, extreme temperatures pushing us over a cliff, right? So that essentially if it gets, maybe species were responding pretty well for a while, right, to increasing temperatures, but if temperatures get above a certain point, then their populations or their performance might really decline. And that seems a really common pattern across many different species, but one that we haven't really yet observed in nature for a lot of species.
How would a young person go into the field of fire ecology? What type of background should they have? What classes should they take in undergrad? I'm thinking of a young 12-year-old who likes to play with fire,
Oh,
but we could maybe turn
yeah.
them into a more productive
There's a
outlook.
place for them, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I think, fire ecology is really closely tied kind of to disturbance ecology in ecology. So I would just say general ecology classes are sort of reasonable. Um, I think if people are interested in fire ecology, one of the things that would be great is if they, got some experience doing prescribed burns, and became kind of involved, and that would teach them some skills and also, get them connected with people who like to set things on fire and could help them sort of steer down the right path.
So I know you mentioned that the Nature Conservancy does that. Is it always like an environmental group who's doing a prescribed burn?
Um, it
Or
depends on what you,
is it like city people? Is it
uh,
like government officials or is it
yeah, so it varies, I think, widely from state to state. So, like people, for example, people who burn, I live in Kansas, people who burn here are often just landowners, right, who are burning their own property. Um, and they don't need specific, well, as far as I know, they don't need sort of specific regulations, or they aren't limited by specific regulations. But in other places, right, like on private or on public lands, right, it's a whole variety of different people. So who is allowed to burn is pretty idiosyncratic. So it varies sort of across different kind of jurisdictions, I would say. But it's often yet some sort of environmental group. Like in our case, the Nature Conservancy is not actually doing the burning. They're hiring a state group that actually does the burning,
Mhm.
because burning is expensive and scary, or can be scary.
And of course we're international, so we can't say like go to your extension office.
No, 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 no.
So look for your Google it.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Russ asks, do you have the soil temperature, like the minimum and the maximum for the Venus flytraps and the type of environment?
We've collected those data, but I could not spout it out. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. But so some of those results that I showed for the climate effects actually use soil temperature, rather than like air temperature as a predictor variable. So we're essentially predicting population sizes as functions of soil temperature data that we've collected in the field.
And Ross also asks, do you measure if the soil pH changes or the parts per million of soil water change, depending on the fire? And then
Yeah,
also, I was thinking like the hurricanes go right through Wilmington, and a lot of salt water is also getting dropped
yeah,
on them.
yes, good point. Yeah, so those are like three different questions, so I'll try to answer them quickly and in sequence. So we don't know, well, for a while we were taking data on soil pH, but then it became logistically challenging because like when a fire burns through, it burns up everything in its path. And so any monitoring equipment you have kind of burns up too. So that was a real bummer. But we think, right, that part of the negative effect of fires on Venus flytrap could be elicited by an increase in soil pH following a fire. We don't have any data to support that, but it seems very likely. So we don't actually know what the exact mechanisms of fire, the negative effects of fire on Venus flytrap are. They could be like consumption of tissue, but they could also be change in pH. We also have estimates of volumetric water content, so essentially how much water is present in the soil. We haven't looked at how those changed post-fire, which is something that we should do. We haven't done that yet, so we don't know if that happens. We have looked at whether or not fires that occur, we've tried to look at whether fires that occur in a dry year are more impactful, right? As you might imagine, if a fire really reduces soil water content. And then saltwater intrusion. Yeah, so we had somebody do a little, like a very small experiment, I think. I wasn't involved in this particular aspect on adding salt to soil because some of our populations, right, are going to suffer from saltwater intrusion or hurricane damage, and others are going to be more buffered from that. And I cannot remember what they found. I don't know. I don't remember.
You think it was a paper or it was just like a...
Nope, it was just a little experiment. I kind of think it didn't. I don't know. I shouldn't say. I have no memory of what happened. Sorry.
All right. Well, Russ, you can do your own experiments and then you can present for us.
Yes. Report. I want to know. So report back to me, or let me know. I would love to know.
All right. Well, very good. Thank you, everyone who attended this International Carnivorous Plant Society webinar live. And thank you, Allison. And we hope to see everyone at the next webinar.
Thanks.
Bye.
It's not a surprise that gardeners, educators, and scientists are fascinated by these unique plants. The International Carnivorous Plant Society, or ICPS, not only love these plants, but welcomes growers just getting started all the way through professional scientists. The ICPS even started an annual World Carnivorous Plant Day to celebrate them. The free online event is held the first Wednesday of May. Take a look around our website and you'll find historic documents about carnivorous plants, growing guides, free educational resources, and more. Have questions? Ask. We don't bite, but our plants do.